It's a wonderful pleasure for me to be here and to get Yevgeniy back again for at least the third time to London, which is absolutely splendid. And of course, what you really want is to hear Yevgeniy talking about his work. But there's some narratives first to introduce you to situate his current exhibition. And also I want to introduce, first of all, the rest of our distinguished panel. And it's a great pleasure for me to meet you both tonight. So first of all, Juliet Jacques is a freelance writer, best known for The Guardian's transgender journey, the first time the gender assignment process has been serialized for a major British publication. Her column was longlisted, that sounds interesting, for the Orwell Prize, very appropriate, in 2011. She was included in the Independent's Pink List for 2012, 13, 14, and is a regular contributor to the New Statesman. She's also written for Granta, Time Out, Film Waves, 3 AM, the London Review of Books, the New Humanist, the New Inquiry, many other publications. I'm delighted to say that, like Grad Gallery, she's in Somerset House. Well, she's just about to leave, but she has experienced, like so many of us here tonight, Somerset House as a home. I'm slightly exiled from my palace at the moment. And but we have that in common, we've just established. But more to the point, she spent some time in Kiev, and her film, called Art, Activism and Politics in Ukraine, is premiering at the ICA on the 27th of March. Now, that's really important. And another great new Russophile for me to meet is Professor Dan Healy, Professor of Modern Russian Art History at St. Antony's College in Oxford, the author of many things, but his first important book was Homosexual Desire in Revolutionary Russia. And coming up with Yale University Press will be his History of Medicine in Stalin's Gulag, Gulag Doctors, the History of Medicine in Stalin's Gulag. I think that sounds very, very, very important. And what's interesting to me is apparently Dan's research was very important for Yevgeniy when you were doing this project, which we can see on the walls here, which were the images in color, which I received one day. It just plonked onto my desk. It published as a book called Moscow. Now, this is the history of, I don't want to kind of give the game away. When I saw these photos, I thought, oh yes, Moscow. I'm interested in Moscow. I thought, these are a bit dingy, some of these photos. And I saw a portrait of Pushkin or somebody, a sculpture with a pigeon on its head. I thought, that's a bit weird. And I didn't get the book until reading it backwards. I suddenly realized that these are a history of gay cruising sites in Moscow. This wasn't a kind of tourist book. Obviously, it was a very intellectual, ugly duckling press book. But the penny suddenly dropped. And of course, the photos became, as opposed to banal, they became uncanny, infused with that past history and all their stories. And I thought, I must meet this man. And that is how I managed to meet Yevgeniy and bring him to London and to the Courtauld Institute, where we actually staged part of the postscript to this book, which I also find extremely moving, which took us back to the 30s, and therefore the period of your research to do with early cruising sites, which was when this guy who worked for the Daily Mail, I believe, in London, called Harry White, so inspired by Stalin's Russia, left the Daily Mail to go and work for, was it Moscow Today or Moscow News? Moscow News. And when he discovered that Stalin was starting to persecute homosexuals, for some reason he just read, it was the 90, who was the guy whose clinic was closed down in Nazi Germany? Exactly, yeah. And he just wrote to Stalin and said, "Dear comrade Stalin, do you realize if you do this, the latest statistics are that 1 in 10 people are homosexual. You will be banishing from citizenship thousands and thousands of Soviet citizens." And you found this in the book that was like bad jokes about the Soviet Union at the moment of the release of archives. And you made your project from that kind of déclic, as one would say in France. And we don't know what happened to Harry White, because we think that the second mystery sort of said, get rid of this man in Stalin's handwriting or something. It's an amazing story that we staged. And then Yevgeniy went to Sussex University, and he came back last year for our Courtauld Art Historians Association conference section on the Comintern and showed his very moving study of Wayne Rudd, the black American actor who went to the Soviet Union, in an evening event at Adler Santi Gallery. And in between that, he's done marvelous projects. In fact, I first saw your first project before I knew you in the Moscow Museum of Modern Art, which was about the Soviet-style films the Soviet Union made after the moment of being allies. And I wrote all these titles down, actually. That was called Song of Russia. Then there was this wonderful Communist Guide to New York. In fact, I know both Andrew Hemingway and Michael Corris, who are the scholars on American communism, and so this was like a tourist guide to communist sites in New York. Then this fabulous project with these little bombs popping up in parks, the project that was actually called quoting the 1950s Red Scare type of rhetoric, homosexuality is Stalin's atom bomb to destroy America. That's one of the most extreme statements. So I think, first of all, the way we're going to go about things is Yevgeniy is now going to explain this very powerful project called Mother Tongue, which is about a kind of homosexual slang which surrounds us here, and which of course relates to the kind of whispered language that would happen in these sites you can see here. Then our respondents are going to individually respond to the project, and then we'll have a question and answer. And I'd just like to say I'm particularly pleased that we're doing this on International Women's Day, because I remember being in Moscow on March the 8th, and I just love seeing these young boys in military uniforms staggering around with absolutely huge bouquets of flowers about 4 feet high. For some reason, your Mother's Day flowers are very, very, very tall. And I mean, it's the most feminized images of tough guys in military uniform. I find it very moving. And of course, they're taking those bouquets of flowers to their mothers. And you're going to explain to us, Yevgeniy, why this project is not just to do with a certain lingo, but is very powerfully called Mother Tongue. So thank you, Yevgeniy. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thanks very much, Pushkin House and Grad, for having my show. It's a pleasure to be here. Project Mother Tongue, the current show, is a continuation of a series of projects about Soviet gay and lesbian history. And the photographs that you see are from a project from 2008, and the current project, Mother Tongue, Родная речь, is more recent. It's from last year, for the most part, done over the last 2 years, and it's about specifically Soviet-era Russian gay slang or jargon or defense language. It depends on your take on this language. And so what I was trying to envision, conceptualize Soviet-era Russian gay slang as a type of self-sufficient, complete language which is separate and distinct from standard Russian. And I'm trying to do this through this exhibition, and perhaps even more through the book, which contains not only a linguistic analysis of the Soviet-era Russian gay slang, but also I'm using this slang to create in it. So most of the book contains poems or conceptual poems. I think of them as poems that I write in the Russian Soviet-era gay slang. So I'm using it as language of high culture. So I'm trying to create literature in that language. And the Soviet-era gay language has been disappearing in recent years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Of course, a lot of a lot of international gay terminology that mostly comes from the English language, entered contemporary Russian gay speech, and but my project is about going back to the pre-1991 Russian gay slang and do something with it. So the poems in the book, they are as if I were writing in poems in Latin or in Hebrew in 19th century, trying to use a so-called dead language, but still produce literature in it. And this project is, so it has a couple of reasons for being. So one is, so I definitely would like to do more work more artwork, because it is a conceptual art project. It's not necessarily a scientific research project. So I'm taking certain liberties and introducing fiction and certain percentage of fiction into this project. But the reason for being for this project is to definitely do more work on Soviet era gay history, but also to specifically to look at local gay history, gay and lesbian history of the Soviet era, and trying to reclaim it or somehow engage it as a authentic, local, grassroots history that maybe, well, I wish it had more presence in, I guess, in contemporary culture. So perhaps I'll stop at this point and pass it to.
So I was in Bishkek last year with Georgi Mamedov and Mahira Suyakalova, discussing Queer in Space, the Kollontai Communist Archive film that they made in 2015, which speculated about the existence of a commune in Bishkek in the 70s and 80s, inspired by the ideas of Alexandra Kollontai, the early Bolshevik feminist theorist and politician. And this seemed like a really interesting, forgotten queer history. You can watch the film online via YouTube. The commune is a kind of poetic approach to history rather than an actual approach to history. The commune did not actually exist. It was sort of something that the Stab group had looked at these kind of queer underground Soviet histories that had not really been allowed to be recorded. They'd not been allowed to exist officially or even particularly unofficially due to the repressive climate of the period. So, you know, the Stab group had pulled out these strands of hidden history and created something slightly more concrete that, you know, was then quite sad to find never actually existed. But that gave me sort of some idea of these kind of underground Soviet queer histories. I then read Dan's book, which, you know, Dan will, I'm sure, draw on when he talks. And then spent more time in Bishkek, also talking to Labris, the LGBT group operating in Bishkek under extreme duress. In 2013, the Kyrgyz parliament introduced a copy of the Putin's propaganda laws about LGBT freedom of expression, introduced a copy of them to the Kyrgyz parliament. And it was initially kicked out of the Kyrgyz parliament because they basically just copied the Russian and crossed out Russia and written Kyrgyzstan. And the Kyrgyz parliament said, no, we're not having this, bring it back in Kyrgyz. So they brought it back in Kyrgyz, and the bill went through 2 readings in parliament. the first two readings, it was passed overwhelmingly by the Kyrgyz parliament, and then just sort of suddenly was dropped into the long grass. And this legislation still hasn't been passed, but it's created a much more repressive climate in Kyrgyzstan. So it's kind of forced this this LGBT culture that was having more expression, kind of forced it back underground, and it's given lots of license to the police to harass LGBT people. It's given license to just like right-wingers and conservatives in the country to harass LGBT people and for people to just beat them up and attack them. Similar thing has also happened in Ukraine, where there are also attempts to introduce a version of this law in 2012 during the Viktor Yanukovych government that fell in the Maidan revolution 5 years ago. I spent the summer in Ukraine looking at this post-Soviet, post-Maidan political situation. And, you know, what I really noted is that, you know, Ukraine since Maidan has had these decommunization laws. So the government has sanctioned this program of removing all visual artifacts from the Soviet period, stripping them out of the major cities in particular. And Ukrainian politics now is this battle between these kind of, you know, if you're the sort of your lefty liberal pinko option is the kind of corporate arms dealing oligarchs, and then the option to the right of that is outright neo-Nazis. And the only thing that really unites them is this kind of hatred of the Soviet past, and the sort of neo-Nazi wing of Ukrainian society is very, very opposed to LGBT people. The kind of more neoliberal wing is very grudgingly tolerant of them, explicitly because they want to be closer to the European Union for kind of financial reasons. And this means that most LGBT expression is happening in Ukraine through art rather than through direct politics, because there isn't really an organised left politics where this can happen. Art exhibitions in Ukraine are frequently attacked, particularly in Kiev. Any art that is dealing with the rise of fascism or is dealing with LGBT topics is frequently kind of attacked by fascists. In fact, Izoliatia, the venue I was doing the residency at, was attacked last week. An exhibition they're putting on about the rise of fascism in Ukraine, which has quite a lot of queer artists contributing to it, has been attacked. So I really saw in Kyrgyzstan and Ukraine an attempt to force kind of queer freedom of expression back underground, which has maybe not succeeded on a legal level, but is operating on this very repressive, violent social level. And so I think you're going to see the same sort of discourse play out again in a slightly different way, of people having to create this coded underground methods of expression and distribution, but just being enforced by slightly different people. Yeah, I'll hand over.
Let me just see. This is working, right? Good, great. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm really grateful to be asked to speak at this event. I think what I want to do is talk a little bit about the things we see in this room, actually. The photographs, first of all. Yevgeniy chose these locations from some of the descriptions of Pleshki in Moscow that I wrote about in Homosexual Desire in Revolutionary Russia. And the information that, that this was based on was really prosecutions of gay men for homosexual offenses in the 1930s and 1940s and 50s. That I found in the archives in Moscow in the 1990s when I was working on that book. And also the testimony of queers who fell somehow into the psychiatric world and who were explaining to psychiatrists what their sexual routines consisted of and where they met other gay men. In the, well, really from the pre-revolutionary period right through until the 1950s, 1960s, 70s. So there, in this case, to contrast perhaps with the Bishkek Shtab Kollontai commune, the locales that Yevgeniy selected were very much associated with some kind of queer culture in Soviet Russia and even in pre-revolutionary Russia. I think it's very important as well that Yevgeniy has turned to language in this new project because if nothing else, Putin's gay propaganda law is an attack on information and is an attack on freedom of speech and the attempt to erect a kind of information regime to cordon off information, positive information or neutral information about LGBT life and LGBT existence and our right to exist. And so by recovering this Soviet era gay and lesbian slang, I think that Yevgeniy is putting before us that medium of expression that has been lost simply by the sort of passage of time and the changes in the way of life of LGBT people in Russia since 1991, the arrival, as Yevgeniy says, of all of this Anglo-American slang that has overlaid the sort of previous self-created and incredibly imaginative slang that gay men and lesbians created for themselves in the 60s and the 70s. And it was recorded by a linguist, Vladimir Kozlovsky, in a book, Argot Gomoseksualnej Kultury, in 1986, published in the United States, in fact. So the material comes from that book, but Yevgeniy has really brought it to life in an exciting way by not merely presenting the terminology of the Pleshka, of the cruising ground, but actually then using it to write his own poetry, which is fantastic, which I really warmly recommend to you in the book that is available for sale. And so I really think that the final point I'd like to make is just that I am observing around the former Soviet Union many art projects like this that are based on historical themes and themes of recovery, of hidden pasts, of lost past, of coded pasts of various kinds, and that stretch the boundaries of what professional historians would feel comfortable with. The Kollontai, the invented Kollontai commune in Bishkek is a particularly interesting example because it is entirely invented. But there are so many projects now that are taking the archive, the limited, I call it the stunted archive in my book, Russian Homophobia from Stalin to Sochi, the stunted archive of Soviet queer existence, and turning it into something expansive, full of different alternative worlds, full of imaginings of how people might have used this language. And in particular, I think how people might have spoken in these places to each other, which is something that I've tried to imagine in some of my historical work, but which really deserves more attention and more imagination, I think, as well.
Is this working? Yes. Could I just ask you one thing, Yevgeniy, before, well, I hand back the mic to you as well, and that is, looking in your book, I saw this list of epithets where, for example, there's the term witch and granddaughter, among others. And I've studied a lot of Jean Genet. This idea of changing things into the feminine is not something that's specifically Russian, of course. It happens all the time. So I'd just like to ask you about how analogous this is, as far as you understand it, or as far as you both understand it, to what goes on everywhere, one. And two, getting back to my original question, your title for the exhibition, Mother Tongue, if that also is one of these coded expressions.
Thank you. Then would you like to start?
No, you start.
So in terms of mother tongue, I think, So definitely mother tongue in and of itself, definitely not coded. And it was simply trying to inject a little bit of nationalism into this project, right? Cultural nationalism. So it's a exactly, yeah. But in my case, it's also kind of the diasporic nationalism, since I have not lived in Russia for a while. And a lot of this in this exhibition is about, properly teaching a language. How do you properly teach a language? There is a video downstairs where it's kind of an instructional video where a college professor or a high school teacher teaches proper vocabulary of the Russian Soviet era language. But in terms of feminine endings, right, for words, so it was definitely super prevalent in Russian Soviet era slang. I'm not sure how universal this is or how international is this phenomenon.
The phenomenon of appropriating the female gender for linguistic purposes among gay men, it's pretty widespread because of the gender inversions that people experience in I think same-sex relationships, and it has been part of Russian culture since well before 1917. It's something that's in Tchaikovsky's diaries and letters. It's something that is part of the Silver Age culture of queer poets like Mikhail Kuzmin and in his diaries and so on. And incidentally, he refers to queer boys or boys who can be turned that he picks up in the Tauride Gardens in St. Petersburg as gramotnie, in other words, literate. So again, the sort of reference to language there. The idea of, because Russian is so rich in gendered forms, especially in the past tense verb, it was very much the case that a certain kind of effeminate men would say, instead of ya pashol, ya pashla, and effeminate themselves that way and build a whole set of speech around it. So here's a little quote from my book I just brought along. And it's a vignette from the Pleshka from about 1978 or something like that. And it's a straight man, straight dissident, is being brought to the Pleshka in front of the Bolshoi Theater and being introduced to a gay man's friends. One of them comes up in a military uniform and he addresses these friends on the bench, this park bench. In a high-pitched voice that cracked from time to time, he sang, "My little dears, if only you knew what a cock I've just sucked." I was shocked on 3 levels. Primo, he was a genuine Air Force officer in an impeccable uniform, blue epaulets and gold buttons. Secundo, despite the masculine sex of those present, he addressed them as little dears, using the feminine gender. Tertio, he spoke of himself in the feminine gender. So this is a very common sort of practice on the Pleshka.
Yeah, I mean, if I were to add something else about the international context, I was greatly intrigued when I read Mother Tongue this week. I mean, firstly, Mother Tongue, Xenia's book, provides obviously a kind of a glossary, a dictionary to help you into this language, because the whole point of these kinds of languages is a world you have to be initiated into, and the text does that work for you that obviously in 60s and 70s USSR you would have had to do through kind of getting to know people. It's a very long process. I mean, just a couple of things I picked out that amused me. The phrase Pleshka's director is code for the Karl Marx monument on Marx Avenue in Moscow, which was a common meeting place for men who were cruising. And people in the text, Ho Chi Minh is slang for a public bathroom in Moscow that was quite popular with with gay men going cottaging. So, you know, obviously that kind of inversion of the Soviet idea, the sort of Soviet imagery is very, you know, it's quite amusing, I think. And you can see the sort of playfulness that people were having in kind of thumbing it to the regime in that way. I mean, an obvious comparison for the language in mother tongue is the British Polari that I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with, this kind of coded queer language that grew up in post-war London in particular, post-war British queer culture at a time before 1967, before the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality in this country. I mean, in Britain, a lot of this got smuggled onto the radio through Kenneth Williams and Round the Horn. I don't know if... I'm guessing the Soviet Union didn't have a popular radio show conducted in Argo, but, you know, Kenneth Williams got away with saying some pretty extraordinary things on mainstream British radio because they're in this this coded language, and that was the obvious comparison to me, and as somebody who's lived my whole life in the UK but with a strong interest in Soviet culture, it was really interesting to be able to draw that parallel in this work.
So I want to ask you something from a learning the Russian alphabet point of view. I can make out pas de deux. So why is it under E? I just don't, there are one or two things I don't quite get. Sexual activity involving two people, pas de deux. We understand that. Yes.
Can you hear me? Yes. So I had to really work really hard on this alphabet to make sure I'll have 33 words for for each letter. So in this case, just the repetition, the presence of ye twice in the word would qualify it as appropriate enough for.
It doesn't begin with ye, and I can think of a word that begins with ye. That might be
but I was also trying to make sure it's always a noun. So all the words here are nouns, So and also I was trying to make kind of balance words, for human anatomy with more abstract terminology, and so that's where my creative work went. Yeah.
And we were talking as well about whether your poems have, as all poems do, other poems underneath them. Not only this man, we were talking about Prigov. I'm not an expert, but obviously I don't associate you with writing poems. Can you say how you came to write poems and what your inspirations were and how you came to write these?
Yes, well, for the book, so project really came into existence once poetry was written, right? Once I kind of stopped simply documenting the language, right? But trying to create something with it, something new. In this case, this conceptual poetry. And I've never written poetry before, so this is my attempt, and of course it has no meaning outside of this project, outside of this book. But in terms of connection to Prigov or Moscow conceptualism, there is a very genuine, kind of tangible connection. The only openly gay post-war Russian writer, Yevgeniy Fiks, was a close friend of Prigov. And there is a lot of wonderful literature that Yevgeniy Fiks wrote in openly gay in late 70s. Mid-70s, late 70s. So there is a very strong, in a way, connection to Moscow conceptualism, I feel. But of course, in Yevgeniy Kharitonof's writing, there is a lot of Russian gay slang also present. And of course, well, he was a Russian gay man of late 1970s, of 1970s. 1960s, but he was writing literature, Russian literature, in which he would address gay subject. But what I'm trying to do in my poetry is to claim that I'm not writing in Russian, that I'm writing it in thematic language, that I'm writing it in thematic language, that this is a language that is a specifically gay Russian language, which is separate and distinct from standard Russian. But it's my conceptual gesture. I'm not sure if it lives up to my, my hopes. So.
I know as well that there was a very specific language in the Gulag, which you must know about because of your study of the Gulag. So what's really interesting is this idea of a multiplicity of languages rather than a dominant language, and the way that subcultures need to both disguise and use shorthand and have little winks, consensus between them. Maybe I'm not in a position to compare. We were also talking about Yiddish before, and of course there's a multiplicity of languages within the Soviet Union. So maybe it would be nice if you could speak a little bit about how these different languages relate to each other or don't relate to each other, what their commonality is, and how they're exceptions which prove the rule.
Thank you. I think that's a really important point. The first thing I would say is it's my impression. I'm not a historian of the Russian language, but it's my impression that the Soviet period of modernization imposed a very standard form of Russian on the country, across the entire country, in a really fascinating and industrial sort of way. So that when you go downstairs and look at Zhenya's video clip of the teacher teaching thematic язык, you'll see a very typical and recognizable sort of language teacher in full flow. A very sort of, if anyone who's tried to learn Russian will have had that experience, I think. And many Russians as well will have had that kind of experience from their experience of pedagogy in Russia. So the first thing to recognize is that there's this carapace of this very standard language, and even to this day, when you go to St. Petersburg, there are these posters in the metro about speaking proper Russian, and using the correct udarenia, the correct stress, and so on. There's a cult of the language police in Russia, I would say. So beneath that are these different sort of subcultural languages and hidden or coded languages, and certainly there is a lot of crossover between the khabalstva, the sort of queer slang of the late Soviet period, and Gulag slang. And part of that was because queers were very visible in the Gulag. It was one place where lesbian relationships were paraded openly, where relationships between men were perhaps not celebrated, but were certainly very visible to most people in the Gulag, and were subject to labels and designations that developed over the 30-year life of the Gulag, from the 1920s into the 1950s at least. And when vast numbers of people get released into Soviet society in the 1950s, they carry that language back with them to the streets, to the Pleshki, to various places. And it's no coincidence that Kozlovsky, in his glossary of homosexual argot in the Soviet Union, includes two glossaries. He has an initial glossary that's really about criminal subcultural language that is related to homosexuality, and a second glossary that is, in effect, civilian language. And you can see the influence between those two.
Thank you. Shall we open this to the floor? I'm sure there must be lots of questions. Shall I pass you a...
Yeah, the mic number one.
That's number one.
Yeah. Would anyone like to ask a question?
Thank you for your contributions. I was wondering, so I don't know much about the topic, but I understand that Polari, or at least the London Polari I'm aware of, has a sort of romantic component. I've heard all sort of, it's a sort of hybrid, sort of linguistically hybridized. There's a lot of foreign etymology, and I think the grammar at its base might be romantic. What are the sort of like the sort of linguistic and etymological genealogy of the of this Russian slang? If anyone has any comment on that.
As I said, there was quite a lot of derivation from the criminal slang of the Gulag. That's a major contributor. You can see from Yevgeniy's work that he's picked out a lot of language that references foreign divas or diva-type characters. That's a very popular leitmotif in this language. And it was actually, even in the period of these 1930 sort of arrests, for example, some of them refer to going to the flat of the Baronessa, who set up parties, that sort of thing. So there's this flashback to sort of aristocratic titles and nom de guerre, as it were. So there's that. There's one of the interesting things about late Soviet queer life is the degree to which it is actually Soviet, all Soviet. And in other words, reflecting some of the other nationalities of the Soviet Union. Nicknames, slangs, characters from popular culture that relate to the other national cultures that were part of the Soviet sort of mental landscape are also there in this language. So in that, I had never thought of this before, but in that it shares something with Polari, I think. Say something about Polari.
I'm not an expert on Polari by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, a lot of that slang was developed in kind of Victorian theatre, because in the mid-Victorian period, there was like, that's where sort of British kind of female impersonation culture grew up until the 1885 Criminal Law Amendment Act and the Oscar Wilde trial. You mentioned a certain romanticism to Polari. Obviously, a lot of the British Romantic poets spent a lot of time in Italy, and there's a sort of, I think there's some like Italian importing into that language, certainly some French importing through kind of French late 19th century literature. So yeah, I mean the sources of Polari are quite diverse as well, but yeah, I'm not an expert.
Church. Can the Russian church help us here?
I'm sorry, you meant the relationship between the church and... The
church, the Russian church and its teachings and its public position, its public pronouncements on family values, on... I ask you, is there anything to say? One thing that I often think about in relation to present day situation of LGBT life in Russia is that in the 80s, as I remember, late 80s or early 90s, the position of the church was super marginal. So to me, I always think, well, the position of late Soviet homosexuals was not much different from true Christians in the Soviet context. But time has changed so dramatically, and over the past 25 years or so, the church became so strong, right? And so the two marginal groups really, parted, over the past, quarter century.
And if I could just say a word or two, I think that one of the great deficiencies of our historical scholarship is that historians who write about the queer history of Russia tend not to write about the church, and historians who write about the church in Russia tend not to write about LGBT history. So I actually am organizing a conference to try and bring those conversations together later in Oxford in April.
Well, I'd just like to ask, thinking of the church and men wearing frocks, is there not a kind of a whole scenario to do with fashion in this? And having just been involved with thinking about one or two Soviet people in exile in the 70s, and actually Anya Stonelake sent me this picture of this absolutely gorgeous bloke walking along the pavement in Paris, who she's invited recently to her gallery. Surely there was a moment, which I'm quite interested in, is when the kind of red barricade French male turns into, a kind of velvet clad person with long hair. There's a kind of mass cultural phenomenon in the 70s. I mean, there was the Transformer exhibition in Bern in 75, and all these boundaries are extremely permeable. I just wondered to what extent any of this language is relating to a kind of huge, a general change and a kind of softening of the male in the 70s, and I know everyone, thought any person that jeans were it, smuggling-wise and things, but was there not a way? I mean, I know that Soviet intellectuals at that time, they also had very long hair and beards when everybody else did. To what extent did this general softening of the 60s male through the 70s affect any of this language? I don't really know. I mean, it's a very, very interesting phenomenon, actually, and it's also, I say to my students, there's a soundtrack to art history or cultural history. There's a big soundtrack thing going on here. It's not just the Beatles, which is very 60s. So I just wondered how that general cultural thing, which is affecting heterosexual males in terms of their hairstyles and their, elephant-style trousers and things, to what extent that is affecting any of this slang before we end, because it's just a little afterthought on my part.
But I have, so I wanted to respond to Sarah's question. So I think regarding the softening of the Soviet male, right, in the 70s or 80s, I think it's also an interesting historical fact that Vladimir Kozlovsky, on whose research about 75% or 80% of my project is based, was a straight man in Moscow in 73, 74, who decided to do a project about Soviet-era Russian gay slang. And he went and approached late Soviet gays and lesbians and struck a conversation. And some of them he met by chance, some were friends of his. So it tells us something about straight men of 1970s, Soviet straight men, right? So I'm not totally sure where homophobia was. How it was working at that point in the Soviet Union. Which is, I think, interesting historical fact.
And I think I would just add that we perhaps forget now just how developed late Soviet consumer culture was and fashion culture was. There is good new scholarship on this, which is reminding us of the degree to which people sought to distinguish themselves through their clothing, through their dress, by either through patterns or through trading clothing with visiting foreigners, or perhaps on that one occasion when somebody would go abroad, either to a fraternal socialist country in Eastern Europe or even to Paris, that they would bring back some treasured blouse or some treasured sort of dress, and that would be pulled apart and replicated by grannies at their sewing machines. There were ateliers all over the big cities in the Soviet Union by the 1970s that were creating fashion to order. You know, you walked in with a design and they would try to make it for you. So people were trying to stand out, and the borders were really tough to penetrate, but they weren't impermeable. And the visuals, I think, moved a lot, and so did the music. Sergei Jacques' work on rock around the block and thinking about rock music and disco music in the 1970s in the Soviet Union, in Soviet Ukraine, for example, Dnipropetrovsk, is really, really interesting work. He goes into the KGB archives of Soviet Ukraine and looks at what the KGB is doing to sort of surveil and monitor this. And at some level, they don't mind Western disco because it keeps these Ukrainian youth from thinking about Ukrainian nationalism. So there are deflection sort of value to that.
Can we get more disco to contemporary Ukraine, because there are Ukrainian nationalists everywhere, and maybe disco is going to save Ukraine.